All right, everybody. Tonight's event, Entheogens 101, how psychedelic plants work. I'll start over. Entheogens 101, how psychedelic plants work in the brain, focuses on the neuroscience and pharmacology of these fascinating natural compounds. We're honored to welcome Joseph Hood, one of our co-founders, and Matthew Gannon, PhD. They're both helping lead the way in this effort. Joseph is a research scientist, an engineer, a musician, and a father and stepfather of 8 kids living right here in Bentonville. He's my man. And Matthew Gannon received his PhD in experimental psychology from the University of Arkansas with a research focus in cognitive neuroscience, and he currently lives in Fayetteville. And I'll let you guys introduce yourselves more from there.
She kind of stole my thunder with that 8 kids thing. That's a fun one. It's hard to explain. It's a long story if you want to know. So like she said, I'm a research scientist in the field of electrical engineering, AI, machine learning, computational methods, which, as you might notice, is not psychedelics. So for psychedelics, I have made a personal study of psychedelics for the past 10 years since being introduced to these plants. And they went from being something like an obscure party drug that I probably didn't want to have anything to do with to being a very important part of my life and others' lives around me. I also am a father of 8 kids, and they all live here in Bentonville. And I'm so tempted to talk about my kids. Let's not do that right now. So I'm excited to be here and talk about this topic. I am going to be leaning heavily on someone who does have some education specifically in this field, and that's Matt Gannon. So I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. So, yeah, my background is experimental psychology. I grew up near Cincinnati, Ohio, moved down here to get my PhD at the University of Arkansas and ended up staying because this is just such a great area. I did leave academia, so I'm not still affiliated with the university. I have taught classes in about 5 years now, so this is if I'm a little bit rusty, forgive me. But I came to, honestly, my background going to college, it took me about 3 years to figure out what I wanted to study. It wasn't actually until I heard, this was early on in the podcast days, but I was very early on the Joe Rogan bandwagon, listening to Joe Rogan talk to somebody, Dennis McKenna, maybe you guys have heard the name. Chemist, talks a lot about psychedelics. So I was exposed to this when I was in college, and that kind of put me on the path to, I want to study. I want to understand what's happening in the brain. So that led me to get a degree in psychology. Ended up getting my PhD in neuroscience, not studying psychedelics or anything really related specifically. Did study neuroplasticity, was kind of my area, mostly in the visual system. But it's just a topic of interest, been a topic of interest for, 15 years now. I've been, maybe even more. It's been a long time since I've been in college now. So that's kind of my background.
All right. Thanks, Matt. So I'm going to start us off with a disclaimer, and I'm just going to read this one word for word. This presentation is intended solely for educational and informational purposes. Our goal is to provide accurate and helpful information about the neuroscience, pharmacology, risks, and harm reduction topics related to psychedelic plant medicines. We acknowledge that there are many paths to growth and healing. However, we do not endorse or assist with any illegal activities involving controlled substances. If you need mental health or medical services, please contact a mental health or medical provider. Okay, with that being said, I'd like to talk about this word first. This is the word that we use in the title of this presentation, which is entheogen. Some of you know this word, and it is our preferred word for the subset of psychedelics or psychoactive substances that we'll be talking about tonight. And it comes from some Greek roots, means generating the divine within, which is a lot cooler than like a hallucinogen or something, right? So we're not really so much concerned about just focusing on the fact that you're going to see and hear things differently, as much as there's something happening very deeply with these medicines. They have a very important part in our cultures and histories. And so this is the word that we prefer. That being said, we're going to throw around the term psychedelics all over the place because that is the term that we tend to use to talk about these. But specifically, these are talking about plants and fungi that are used in a spiritual or religious context to induce altered states of consciousness, and specifically that have been around and been used for this purpose since ancient times. So what plants are we talking about? So I'm going to make a 3-circle Venn diagram. These are our favorite things to look at, and this is where my engineering will kind of be able to come out a little bit. We're going to start with plants. We're talking about plants. We're talking about plants and fungi. So these are things that are grown from the ground. They're not synthesized. They're not concentrated. They're not isolated. They're not patented. They're just things that grow out of the ground. So that's something that we want to focus on here. I will say as kind of a caveat that there is a whole class, a whole area of psychedelics that exists that are either concentrated forms, synthesized outside of the plant area. And we're not saying anything about those being something that no one needs to use at all. It's just not what the focus is for this particular effort and what we're talking about tonight. These are also relatively safe. These have a good safety profile. We'll look at some actual data and numbers and really drive that point home. These are generally very safe with a low probability of abuse. They tend to not be addictive. In fact, they tend to be anti-addictive. These are also, again, ancient. Why is that important? Because there's a couple ways that you can kind of determine that something is safe and effective. You can try to have double-blind, randomized control studies in clinical environments, or you can let humans co-evolve with some plants for a few thousand years, and we'll figure it out, right? And so that's the benefit of these particular class of psychoactive compounds is I'm carefully using the term, or maybe inappropriately saying co-evolve. That's kind of more of a theory, right?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
But they've been on this planet for a long time, and we've been using them for a long time. There's something to it, right? There's something to that fact that those go together. And so the intersection of all three of these are these plants and fungi that we're talking about. Mushrooms containing psilocybin, those are probably the ones that you know most and are the most popular. But also ayahuasca, which the active compound there is DMT. Ayahuasca also contains, as many of you know, other compounds from other plants that synergistically work together in different ways. But we'll focus kind of from a pharmacological standpoint on the DMT. Cacti containing mescaline. So that would be San Pedro and peyote and maybe others, but those are the ones that tend to be used. Those also have a very important cultural, religious history in many cultures and many groups. And the last one, it may be a little bit obscure. Maybe some of you have not heard of this. This is iboga. This is native to Africa, maybe some other locations as well. And it is part of this group because it generally matches the same profile and same uses as these other ones. And it also tends to be extremely good at addiction recovery. So all of these have a long history, again, at least 1,000+ years. If you look at the history of some of these guys, just what we know about them, you look at the first known usage, it starts with BC, right? Like these have been around for a long time in some form or another. So by the way, interactive, engaging, anything that you want to say or throw in. I failed to mention that. I won't point you out, but there's someone that knows a lot more about pharmacology in this room than we do. So feel free to chime in with anything. But any comments or questions so far? All right. I do want to take one moment here. This is a little bit of a meta comment. Like, this is great. Like, look at the group here, right? So just think about like just a couple years ago. Yeah, we were just talking like maybe even a couple years ago. Like, would we be willing to kind of come out of the woodwork and come out from our, our back porches and living rooms to come and talk about it here at this place, right? Like that's a testament to the zeitgeist of how we live right now in this world and also this community, and also how many people this has probably touched and will touch presently and in the future. So along those lines, why this matters, I'm going to dig into that just a little bit. These plants are being used in our community. right? Like I will say the phrase, whether you like it or not. I'm assuming everyone in here is probably generally okay with that, right? But whether you like it or not, whether anyone out there likes it or not, these are being used in our community. So what does that mean for us, right? There's information, discussion about these happening everywhere. People with PTSD, depression, specifically treatment-resistant depression, trauma, they're looking for healing. Some of them are finding healing in other ways. A lot of them are not. And so returning to things that tend to appear to work for people and appear to be ancient remedies for some of these ailments, or there's something bigger going on with just the whole system, right? Let's not get too philosophical there. There are efforts underway to increase access and to make this more available and more able to be talked about in these forums. And so I like to think of, we talk about these three different prongs here that are underway. And they're not all the same, right? So there's different approaches, they're synergistically working with each other, and different people are playing different roles. There's legalization, which also goes along with medicalization, and that's really about assimilating these plants into the medical model that we have, right? And that is what a lot of people are working on. There's the MAPS effort and everything involved with that. There's the work that Johns Hopkins is doing, so there's a lot of research. There's also a lot of chemicals that are being synthesized and being patented and being tweaked and altered, and a lot of money put into that side as well. So that's kind of the legalization, medicalization side. There's also a lot of efforts that will fall under decriminalization. And the kind of short bumper sticker explanation of decriminalization that I like to use is no one should go to jail for this, right? Despite anything else you have to say or anybody thinks about this, let's not put people in jail for this. Let's at least not do that, right? So decriminalization is also another one of these efforts. And thirdly is churches, religious institutions that are being established or reestablished for the purpose of providing a community where these things can be used, in many cases, using their ancient cultural roots in the way that that's done, but also providing religious protection, which is a very strong protection in this particular country and specifically, and not to get too far ahead of myself, but we'll talk about some upcoming events where we're going to talk about that topic a little bit more. So all that being said, we need to be educated as a community, right? And that's what this is. We really love doing this in the library. This feels like an extension of the public square, right? This is not just, we're not just renting some place at a hotel or something like that, right? This is a place where the community gets together to read books, do events, hang out with your kids, and also talk about entheogenic plants and fungi, apparently. Now, this is important for a couple reasons. Harm reduction, knowledge is safety. There's a lot of misinformation or non-information or fear about these plants, right? And because they've been stripped out of our culture for so long and we're trying to reintroduce them now, and it's, we don't have the knowledge. We know a lot about alcohol. We're very comfortable with alcohol being integrated into our culture. Alcohol's terrible, right? Like, I like alcohol. I kind of take Winston Churchill's, what does he say? Like, I've gotten more out of alcohol than alcohol's gotten out of me, right? Okay. So far, right? But, alcohol is, we're going to do some comparisons here, and many of you know, it's just very different from these substances as far as safety profiles and things like that. So all that to say, knowledge is safety, knowledge is power, knowledge is acceptance and availability and access. We also want to be able to make informed policy decisions. So as Bentonville, Fayetteville, Northwest Arkansas is doing whatever it's doing, right, in its progression and its growth and its change, where do these plants fit in? Where do these practices fit in? All of that, right? Sorry, were you raising your hand for me or just waving at somebody? Okay. And I do recognize another person that may be an expert, so I'm kind of a little bit more nervous now. So we're going to, a little bit here, dive into some harm reduction topics. I don't feel like it's a good thing for us to sit here and meet and just have a big kumbaya moment and talk about how great these things are, right? So let's talk a little bit about some of the risk and how to mitigate those. Harm reduction. So right out the right out of the gate, substance use always comes with intrinsic risks. That's everything, right? Hand me my coffee right there. Whenever I need to calm down because I'm going to give a speech, I like to get a cup of coffee in the late afternoon, right? I don't know about you guys. This is actually decaf. Does anybody know like how many cups of coffee are toxic or fatal for the average human? Does anybody know that number? It's not as many as you think. It's like 100. Yeah, so, which I feel like I could do, which is unfortunate, right? So this comes with risk, right? Caffeine also does have more dependence than some other substances that we may use throughout our day. And that has its own risk. It does have some neurological effects. Substances have risk inherently. Generally, though, many of those risks can be mitigated. There are mitigations for those risks. I'm going to go back to alcohol again. How do we mitigate the risk of alcohol? Well, we have laws around not being able to drink and drive. We have laws around how old you need to be to have it and who can sell it and permitting and all these things. All those things to try to kind of maintain some kind of sanity with how that substance does have some risk. What are some of the risks that we're thinking about? Toxicity and dependence. Is it going to hurt me, kill me? Am I going to get addicted to it? That's an important consideration with any substance. Do I have any pre-existing conditions, or are there any interactions with other medications or substances that I'm taking? That's important as well. Adverse psychological effects. So like kind of the point of psychedelics or entheogens is to have a psychological effect, right? But we don't want to have adverse ones or ones that we don't want, specifically ones that are long-term or severe, can cause problems. This is another one that we came into, really digging into what the true harms are that we need to mitigate in a community that is using these. One thing that we came across talking to the therapeutic community is this idea of a breach of therapeutic ethics, right? That's one that you may not think about, right? So think about how therapists work and counseling works. There's a whole ethical framework around how those therapies and that counseling takes place. There's an inherent power dynamic between a caregiver, a guide, and a user of these substances that can be abused or misused or not understood, right? And so breaching therapeutic ethics, or frankly not having a therapeutic or having an ethical framework to fall back on to kind of support the community through these experiences. And of course, one of the harms is legal consequences, right? This is kind of disconnected from the other ones in a strange way for many of these, especially when you look at the safety profiles, but it can be dangerous to use these because of law enforcement and legal consequences, right? So that's something that has to be considered, hence decriminalization. But what are some of the mitigations of these? Proper substance sourcing and dosing. So again, education, education, education. We live in a world of hyperconnectivity on the internet, and there's gobs of information. So one thing that we can do tonight is at least point you in the right direction for harm reduction resources where this kind of information is spelled out and talked about in detail. Knowing when you should stay away. We have a whole slide after this, just kind of don't do it if, or like probably don't do it if any of these things are true. Setting and support from an experienced guide or therapist before, during, and after, right? So it's not just when these things are being used when you're in that mental state. There's preparation before, and there's often integration work. In fact, integration work is this long process and a very deep topic that we can do an entire education night on, and we have from those that are very knowledgeable in that area. Okay, another thing that we can do to mitigate is, again, think about the decriminalization efforts and how that can allow us to all feel safer talking about it, sharing, integration into existing guilds of guides and ethical frameworks that can help keep people safer, and again, get the information out there so that people have the right information to stay safe. A few resources here that we're not going to click on any of these links. Let me get that out of the way. Some of you know some of these: Zendo Project, Fireside Project, tripsitters.org, Arrowid, which is like the Wikipedia for this stuff. It's really huge. So these are things that we're not going to go into that, and that's not even what this is about, is going there. But harm reduction, right? Knowledge, information, important. Who is at higher risk when using these psychedelic medicines? I'm not going to go through this whole list. This is and this is in no way exhaustive at all, but there's a few things here to look out for. I'll point out a couple of them. People under the age of 25, right? Your brain is developing. We really don't quite have a good handle on that. Now, kids are going to go off to college and use this stuff, right? And I'd probably rather them use this than some random thing that somebody gives them or something that they don't know what it is. That being said, in a perfect world, we might, really think about whether under 25 is appropriate for this as your brain is still developing. Another thing is, among the adverse psychological effects that tend to happen, they tend to be related to having a family or personal history of more severe mental disorders such as schizophrenia, bipolar, or psychosis. And so there is and this is even with marijuana, like you could trigger some severe effects or even trigger a schizophrenic break if it was going to maybe happen anyway, right? These things do have a lot of action in the brain that can cause a lot of things to happen, especially if you have a family or personal history there. And anything else to point out there? I think that's good, right? So it's not risk-free. This is not just a kumbaya, let's all do this and be happy. Yes?
And this might be, is there any research at all that would connect some sort of adverse effect on brain development for people who are doing that?
That's a great question. I don't know specifically. That would be a very hard thing to study experimentally. Yeah. I think you could ethically. To get your IRB to allow for something like that. I think you would have to look at correlational studies, and I do know, there's at least some correlational stuff. Early use of marijuana usage might have worse outcomes. It's tricky to disentangle. There's a lot going on there, but I think just as a general rule of thumb, if your brain's still developing, keep the other substances out of it is like just a kind of just a rule of thumb.
See, I would think that the adverse argument could be made that the enhanced neuroplasticity would actually.
It could definitely go either way. You could say you don't need the neuroplasticity when your brain is still developing. I think with the substances we're talking about it can be very intense psychological experiences, and so if you're not equipped to kind of deal with integrate those experiences, I don't know that it is necessarily harmful to the brain itself, but might be more of a psychological issue.
One last thing about that, like we have history of that with indigenous cultures.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And that's the interesting thing there, right? Because how do you reconcile that? That is being used at that age in those cultures, right?
Yeah. So cultural differences is probably, the culture we're in right now, I don't know if I would trust kids to.
the sense I get from like young brains and a lot of these substances in the research is mostly that we don't have the research, not that it's showing it to be terrible for them, right? So.
That's probably accurate, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there you go. I can even kind of zoom in there. If you remember one link, it can be to our website where we have a whole list of resources there, including these ones. So these are specifically about harm reduction. Some of these organizations are not just about providing information. They're actively providing harm reduction. They're doing testing, they're showing up. They're trip sitters. If you don't have one, you give them a call, that kind of thing. Right? So there's a lot of active harm reduction activities going on out there. Okay, so this is where we're going to try to make a little trade-off here, and I won't even introduce it. You just dive right in. Okay, so yes. Oh yeah, go ahead.
It's not a question, it's a comment. Like native Indians have been using datura as a right to adulthood, where literally they hallucinated for 36 hours, and then they had no memory of their childhood.
Wow.
So
okay.
They truly use it as a gateway to be an adult.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that sounds a little extreme. But also, that could be useful.
Well, datura is very powerful. Right?
Yeah, and which kind of speaks to another thing. Like, there's a lot of historical use of this, and we can't make the mistake to just say that just because it's been used that way historically in certain places that it's automatically something that we want to do now, right? So it also has to fit within how we're living now and what we're doing, what our goals are, whatever, right? And so it's not we're not just going to take that and culturally appropriate it and map it to our life somehow, but so that's a complex topic. All right, Matt.
All right, so getting a little bit more into the safety profile of kind of substances more generally. So this you can think of sure.
I've been trying for a while to figure out the interactions with SSRIs and psilocybin, and I've seen some more current research where they're leaning towards it might not interact in a bad way, but I don't know, it seems to be a little all over the place.
Yeah, so I'll get into a little bit of that in a.
So I'll
Sure.
repeat the question for those that didn't hear it.
Yeah.
The interaction with SSRIs and these, right, that's a big topic because a lot of people, a lot of us have been or are on SSRIs. So how does that fit into
Right,
this?
and a lot of what we're going to kind of get into is the therapeutic effects of psilocybin is to alleviate depression. So it would likely be you might have a history of SSRIs or be currently on SSRIs. And I want to show this in a little bit, but they work they both work on serotonin receptors, right? So SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, so which means that they basically allow the serotonin to stay in the synapse and continue working for longer. That's kind of what is thought to give it its therapeutic effect. The classical psychedelics are serotonin agonists. They work like serotonin on serotonin receptors. So I don't know exactly what interference there might be on that. If it's, you would think that it would be kind of an additive effect, if you're increasing the efficacy of serotonin in two different ways. But right, it's basically working like serotonin, right? So I don't know if an SSRI would keep that the psilocybin in the synapse for longer as well. Yep. Yeah. So anytime that you're taking any kind of pharmacological drug that is changing the neurochemistry, your body's going to have a reaction to that, right? It's not going to necessarily be immediately, but it can be over a period of time. If you're taking a drug that increases serotonin activity, the neurons in your brain might pull serotonin receptors out of the synapse. And so it kind of wants to come to this equilibrium. If it's exposed to a lot of dopamine, it's going to take dopamine receptors. It doesn't need, you could think of it, it doesn't need as many dopamine receptors because it's being flooded with dopamine constantly. But now you take that substance away, now you're left with fewer receptors, and then your body's kind of having to readjust, and you can have dopamine depletion or a serotonin syndrome. I don't know the long-term effects of that interaction. You might know more.
I know
Yep.
just generally that it requires more of the psychedelic to have an effect if you're on an.
It does have a dulling effect in many cases.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is kind of counterintuitive. Okay. Yes.
That's how I've always.
Yeah, like a competition of
At the receptor site.
That's what I've always.
That makes perfect sense.
They're essentially blocking the parking spots
For the psilocybin. Yes.
SSRI, and it's delaying the process and keeping them in the receptors longer. So then if you're taking serotonin agonist,
Yep.
there's not a place for it to go.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's why
The dulling effect. Yeah.
Where that becomes dangerous is with MDMA or something that's actually something increasing serotonin. That's where you can get that serotonin syndrome.
Okay. And so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And high levels of serotonin. So, kind of jumping ahead to where we're going to be going. Drugs that work as serotonin antagonists, so they block serotonin receptors, are antipsychotics. So it kind of is two. You can think of this as two sides of the same coin. Where if you're having too much serotonin, a serotonin antagonist works as an antipsychotic. So too much serotonin, maybe logically, could lead to psychosis, psychotic effects.
Most advisable, if possible, is to have weaned off. Of
Yeah,
the
you probably
SSRIs
need a washout period. Exactly. So yeah, that's all. Yeah, very important stuff to know. that kind of goes along with with the harm reduction and with the safety profiles of these drugs. Certain different ways you can think of a safety profile is this therapeutic ratio, so the active dose to the lethal dose. So you can go less toxic to more toxic. And what I'd rather this be as an odds ratio. I should have put this in here. So just using alcohol, for example, has this therapeutic index of 0.1 or therapeutic ratio. So that 0.1, 1 over 10, right? And so what this is saying is the active dose to the lethal dose would be 1 to 10. Alcohol is very easy to think about. You might say an active dose, 2 drinks, right? A lethal dose, 20 drinks, right? That's kind of a very reasonable way to think about that. And so then as you're moving leftward on here, you're getting less toxic. So if this is 1 to 10, now you have 1 to 1,000. So caffeine, it would be 1 to 1,000. Way kind of on our far left, LSD, psilocybin, marijuana, things that it's really not feasibly possible to consume that much to be a lethal dose. MDMA is going to be much more closer to alcohol, and then of course heroin up in the top right is going to be right. It's a much finer line between getting that active dose and what can be a deadly dose. What's it? Fentanyl isn't on the chart. Yeah.
Fentanyl is interesting because it doesn't necessarily have a worse therapeutic index. It's just that the absolute amount that you have to take to kill you is so tiny.
It's so small,
right?
Yeah.
It's so tiny.
Yeah. Because I mean, fentanyl's been used in the medical setting for a long time, and I'm sure they understand how to titrate that very well. And then you can also think about the dependence potential. So this is a little bit more subjective, but from the bottom we have less addictive drugs. So LSD, psilocybin, all of the entheogens that we're going to be talking about are in this very low addiction band. As you move up, you see things like caffeine, marijuana. I think marijuana is probably, this would just be my conjecture, might be increasing due to the dosages that are available today. It's probably, it might be bumping that up. If you go back to the 1970s, maybe that would be, the swag weed was down in the very low. But so you can plot things out, and it's kind of good to look at these two dimensions where you're looking at dependence, prevalence or potential in this how lethal a drug might be. Another way that you can kind of look at the same. Is there a pointer on here? It doesn't show.
Doesn't really show.
Okay.
But you can draw if you want to like circle.
I just like to use my pointer. Yeah. So another way that you can look at these harm scores. So you can look at things. So kind of getting into the more minutia of harm to others and harms to the users versus harms to the other. So in this one, alcohol actually scores higher than heroin. When you're adding up all of the kind of the costs that come with that. And then again, here at the bottom, you have your LSD and your mushrooms, and these are mental impairment. Yes, you're taking a very powerful hallucinogenic drug. There's going to be mental impairment. That's kind of the point to an extent. So there is going to be some kind of, if you consider that harm, especially if the set and setting are not proper, it could. If you're not prepared for what you're getting into and you're not respectful about it, there can be obviously negative effects of that experience.
This was a big study done with a lot of data in the UK.
Yeah.
Right. And they're really trying to say what's the total harm for these things. It's not just like what's happening while you're doing, what's the harm to society, to other people, everything.
Right.
And it is interesting that alcohol floats
yep.
to the top when you do that kind of comparison. But,
yeah.
But I still got more out of it than it got out of me. So,
yeah, everything has its dosage. Yeah. All right, so going to get more into the kind of the neuroscience now. Does anybody have any questions so far? This has been good, kind of back and forth. So anything that's not clear, definitely pipe up. So before we talk about the effects of these substances on the brain, I want to talk a little bit about the way the brain works more generally to kind of as a setup here. So this is just kind of a basic diagram that you can find in like a psychology textbook of a neuron. So the neuron being the cells of the brain. And I'm not going to go through all this. I'm not going to test you guys on this. But you could think of the cell has a receiving end and a sending end. So it receives messages through these what are called dendrites, so these little protrusions that are coming off. These messages get integrated in the cell body, and if it's receiving a sufficient excitatory message, it will pass a message on to the cells it's connected with, right? And so what it does is at these axon terminals, they will release their neurotransmitter to the cells that it is interconnected with, right? And so the important part here is that the way that cells in the brain communicate with each other are through chemical messengers, right? This is the way that neurons, cells in the brain, cells in the nervous system interact, is through chemical messaging. And so there's lots of different neurotransmitters. A couple that we've talked about: serotonin, dopamine. These are kind of in the popular culture. They're talked about a lot. A hit of dopamine, or you have low serotonin. These things are talked about, but there's lots of neurotransmitters, and those are not even the primary neurotransmitters that are facilitating kind of the message activity in the brain. But it's a good way to kind of think about this. But so at that synapse, so the space between where cells communicate with one another is called the synapse. So chemicals are released into the synapse, and the receiving neuron will intake that message. And so when you're taking drugs, when you're taking kind of any substance, whether it's caffeine, whether it's alcohol, whether it's nicotine, whether it's any of these psychedelics, whether it's anti-anxiety medication or anti-depression medicine, right? They're working through these chemical messengers. All the activity is going to be at these chemical messenger sites where the sending neuron will send a message to the receiving neuron at these neurotransmitter receptors. Does that make sense? And so when we talk about the effects of drugs, you can kind of think about them working in one of two ways. They can be an agonist at the receptor, which means it facilitates the effect of a neurotransmitter at the receptor, or it can be an antagonist, so it can inhibit the effect or block the effect at that neurotransmitter. And I'm not going to go through this. This is just to kind of show this can get very complicated. There's lots of ways that you can block or facilitate action at neurotransmitter receptors, right? The ones that we're going to be talking about, so the classical psychedelics, they're fairly simple. They work at serotonin receptors. They're specific serotonin receptors, but they work directly on that receptor. Things like SSRIs, where I alluded to earlier, they block the reuptake of the serotonin, so they keep the serotonin in the synapse for a longer period of time, both having the effects of kind of increasing activity at the serotonin receptor, just different mechanisms, and there's lots of mechanisms through which you can have those effects. Serotonin is the primary neurotransmitter we're going to be talking about. We've been alluding to this. SSRIs are used to alleviate depressive symptoms. So serotonin, there goes to follow, is involved in mood regulation, right? So it plays a key role in emotional processing, dysregulations associated with depression, anxiety. And so SSRIs are the most commonly used pharmaceutical drug in America. So a lot of people are being exposed to this. Other aspects of serotonin, it's involved in thalamocortical gating, which is kind of getting into I like the sensory systems. The thalamus is a midbrain structure where, so your eyes receive messages. That goes to the primary visual cortex. Before any sensory information goes to its primary sensory cortex, it goes to the thalamus. It's kind of this relay station. And so serotonin's involved in the thalamus, in the sensory filtering. And so what we're going to be talking about, so psychedelics are active on these serotonin receptors, and so these can cause these altered perceptions. So has anybody heard of synesthesia?
Yeah.
Does anybody have synesthesia?
Not all the time.
No, not all the time. Yeah, it can be temporarily induced, right? So synesthesia is this effect where you have this kind of blending of the senses where, so the most common one is called grapheme visual or grapheme color synesthesia, where numbers and letters actually take on a color for an individual. So an F might be blue, or the number 4 might be red, and it's this. There's different kind of versions. It can be this very low level, just perceptual experience that people have, or auditory visual blending, where certain tonal notes will have certain colors to them, right? I remember very vividly learning about this in intro psychology. I think there is no way that this is real. This is very real. It actually runs in families. There's lots of kind of really cool testing you can do to kind of pull apart at what level is this occurring. Anyway, this can be induced through, right, the use of psychedelic drugs. And so the way that is likely being induced is through this kind of serotonin receptors in the thalamus, allowing these messages to not necessarily, a visual message might not only go to the visual system, now it's going to be influencing the auditory system as well. Yeah.
The thalamocortical.
Yeah.
There's a study right now where they're that I saw where they're looking to see if there's a connection with DMT being the production area in that part of the brain.
Interesting. Yeah. So DMT.
It's like that gatekeeping space.
Yeah.
Kind of what creates your perception of reality.
Yeah, DMT is super interesting. I don't think I put anything into it on the slide for that, but yeah, DMT is endogenously produced in some kind of trace amounts at least, and so there's lots of theories about near-death experience. Well, yeah, where it's being produced and
why
and why. Yeah,
why is it in our brain?
Why is it there? What effects is it having? Yeah, very cool, very cool. So, and thalamocortical just is referring to in neuroscience. If you're talking about two different brain regions, you just mash them together. So the thalamus and the cortex is thalamocortical. So going from the thalamus to the primary visual cortex or auditory cortex is where that word comes from. Serotonin, we've already discussed this. Agonists that work on the serotonin receptors, SSRIs, the most commonly prescribed psychotropic meds, antidepressants, and the classical psychedelics. So LSD, mushrooms, peyote, ayahuasca. Ibogaine isn't included in the classical psychedelics. It works differently, which I'll talk a little bit more when we get to that. But then, like I alluded to earlier, an antagonist that would work, inhibit activity at those serotonin sites are the antipsychotics. So I studied those in my undergrad with rats. They're actually commonly prescribed in children with like behavioral disorders, and so we were looking at some of the kind of the long-term effects of that those might have on serotonin and dopamine receptors. The safety profile, there's been quite a bit of study. So when you start studying some kind of a substance, especially if it's a Schedule 1 illegal drug, the first things you got to do is look at its safety profile, right? So there's a guy, some of you guys probably know Rick Strassman, back in the 90s. I think he was at New Mexico or New Mexico State. He wrote the book DMT, The Spirit Molecule. So he was kind of doing some of this very early work in the 90s on the safety profile of giving people DMT. So anyway, that's where you want to start. Before you can look at what are the subjective effects, the therapeutic effects, you want to make sure, you want to understand what this does physiologically to people, make sure that this is safe to give. There's been a meta-analysis, 3,500 participants from 114 studies looking at the safety profile of classical psychedelics. Among healthy participants with no background of any kind of psychiatric illness, no serious adverse effects. So 3,500 people, there were 0 serious adverse effects. People with pre-existing mental neuropsych disorders, 4% had a serious adverse effect. So this is quite a step up. I don't know what the N was on this. How many? I'm sure it's probably a pretty small number that were out of that 3,500 that had pre-existing conditions. But 4% is a little bit of a substantial number. These serious adverse effects. So these are things like psychosis, worsening of depression, suicide ideation, these kinds of things. So because of that, like we talked about earlier. You have to be careful. This shouldn't be used by everyone all the time. So if you have a history of kind of mental illness, that might not be for you.
Clarification question: 4% is that 4% of the 3,504, or
4% of 100% of the individuals that were selected who had pre-existing conditions.
Yep.
4% of those.
4% of those. So you're right. So out of the 3,500, who knows how many had, I'd have to look back at the study to know what was the N, how many, what's your denominator there? Right. Yeah. But 4% is nothing, is something to kind of be weary about.
So, what if you are unaware?
Right. Yes. And so that is one of the big risks of having kind of such an intense psychological experience. Even if you don't have a family history, what if you don't know? And so that's always something to be aware of. Now, the people that didn't have any kind of pre-existing, there were 0. So it doesn't seem like there were any cases like that, at least in these studies. But that's just always something,
I've heard of it happening, but I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just like anything else, you take an antibiotic and you don't realize you're going to have a reaction to it. There's always going to be that risk. Pretty rare, yeah. So there were none across these 3,500 participants. That doesn't, if it's more than 1 in, if it happens at a rate of 1 in 10,000, you might not pick that up. But it would be rare. But I'm sure that does happen. All right, and a lot of times you might not know if you have a family history of this. Maybe your parents didn't talk about what the problems they had.
I'm thinking a little bit about anytime you take an MAO inhibitor, anything that's in your system can be. And so how do they isolate that this is the ibogaine doing that versus just the MAO inhibitor and anything else that could have in it?
So the ibogaine had some decently sized cardiovascular or cardiac events. I don't know if these people were on. I'm not sure if they said what they were, other drugs that they might be taking, but maybe it's an interactive effect.
There's just a lot less in literature about ibogaine, and so there's a lot of unknowns, and it's difficult to compare. And also the data that we do have, a lot of it is, it's we don't have the body of work that we have for the classic psychedelics.
Ibogaine's much. I feel like it's it's gained a lot of popularity. I feel like I've heard about it in the popular culture in the last few years. From the Joe Rogan podcast is mainly where I've heard people talk about that. But I wasn't aware of the level of the cardiac risk potential that it actually had.
There is, in one of these references here, there were 0 events for anyone that had proper care or medical attention during the experience. And so it does seem like it can be controlled. But it is the one thing on the list here where we're like, don't go out and do this with your friends, right? Because it does seem to have a different, not as well understood safety profile and how to deal with it. So there's another question back here.
Well, I noticed that the ibogaine one is the study of administration of the detoxification of opioid dependent individuals.
Yeah.
Maybe the opioids damage their heart and kidney.
That was mentioned. That was mentioned in the study as well. It's not clear how much of that played into it. But the one reason why we're even talking about it is it appears to be just extremely effective at curing opioid addiction. So there's something to it. Yeah.
And what was that? Yes.
Texas just passed a thing with ibogaine.
Texas did.
Like by a lot.
Yeah, Texas just passed it. They're allowing it to be studied now.
Oh, good.
At the state level.
Both the University of Utah and the National Healthcare System in Mountain West, they're actually doing that right now.
Okay.
They're heading it up to potentially legalize psilocybin.
Right. So inroads are getting made in lots of places on understanding we need to be studying this stuff. It's being used. It's showing very powerful effects. We need to kind of destigmatize this. These are just compounds that are found in nature. they have these specific effects in our brains.
Let's study them.
Let's study this. Yeah, let's maybe not just sweep it under the rug. So I'll kind of quickly go through each of these four entheogens and kind of more about their specific effects. So psilocybin, we've been talking about. It's the most prevalent of the entheogens. 12% lifetime usage in the United States. So more than 1 out of 10 people have experienced this. 2% in the last year. So I think that kind of goes to show the lack of abuse potential, right? So if 12, you've had 1 out of 10 people do this in their lifetime, but then only 2% have done it in the last year. It's a pretty good ratio of, I think what people that have experienced this is probably tell you don't need to do this more than once a year. At the most, once a year is sufficient.
I do want to point out with this slide that you have the serotonin embedded inside of the
so there's the molecule. You can see how similar psilocybin is to serotonin there. The tryptamines.
When you said you only need to do this once a year, are you talking about from a physiological perspective or from a psychological?
From a psychological perspective, I'd say most people that experience this would say you probably don't. You can take a year off from after a good experience. It's not something that you come back to. It's not like, man, that was so much fun. I want to do this again next weekend. This man, that was a lot of fun. I'll come back in 3 or 5 years. Of course,
that doesn't get into the microdosing conversation. And we can maybe say what we know about that, and we can have a discussion. But that's a different thing.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. So it's primarily a serotonin. So 5-HT is serotonin. There's a specific receptor that it's an agonist for, so the 5-HT2A. There's additional interaction on other serotonin receptors. But psilocybin, because it's been studied the most of these drugs, we do know a little bit more about it, and its promotion of neuroplasticity. So both structural neuroplasticity, so you will see through these different mechanisms, the formation of new dendrites, new dendritic spines, and synapses. So actually, you're connecting with more cells, more neurons. In neurogenesis, so it's actually the creation of new cells in the brain. So this is in the hippocampus, and also functional connectivity changes. So you can think of functional connectivity changes as so you might have these two brain regions that have a structural connection, but their activity is not necessarily correlated with one another. So when one is active, it doesn't necessarily mean it's making the other one active. When under the effects of psilocybin, you get these massive functional connectivity changes where brain regions that are connected structurally now become very correlated in their activity. So there's this increases in global integration. So the kind of all these different brain regions are now talking to each other. And what the converse of that is decreases in the default mode network. So have you guys heard of the default mode network? This has kind of become popularized in the last in the neuroscience literature, really in the last 10 to 15 years. The default mode network is kind of this set of brain regions or this network within the brain that is active while you're kind of just sitting and doing nothing. So if you're not engaged in a specific task that you're very externally focused on, if you're just daydreaming or cutting the grass, I find when I'm cutting the grass, it's almost like a very meditative thing where it's like you're not fully engaged in what you're doing. You're kind of going through the motions, but you're kind of just lost in your own thoughts, right? This would be activation of the default mode network. So this is when you're kind of introspecting or thinking about your past or imagining a future. It's this kind of very self-referential. These are like your thoughts, right? Would be when this default mode network is active. And so you see decreases in the default mode network under the effects of psilocybin. You actually see increases in default mode network in people with depression. So if you think about what happens with people with depression, rumination, right? You're constantly thinking about all this negative rumination, which is one of the hallmark symptoms of depression, right? So maybe this is another way where that's alleviating some of those symptoms.
There's a question in the back.
Is this also a time of
Probably, it's probably if it's very mindless, if you're not really engaged in a task. So scrolling, probably, you're just looking for that next thing to be stimulated by. But if you're thinking of other things, could be in that default mode network. Yeah. Driving is a great example where you're on autopilot. Yeah. Unless you're a new driver, sometimes you're on a long drive. It's like, how the heck did I even get home? I don't even remember getting off the exit now. Because we have a very good. There's almost a kind of a bias to kind of get into that default mode network. This is a really cool diagram from a paper that was looking at people that were on psychedelics versus a placebo, and looking at the way that their brain structures had functional connections with other brain regions. So each of these like little circles you can think of is a brain region, an area of the brain, and the links here are the functional connections that it has with other regions of the brain. So in the placebo group, this might be somebody's sitting in an fMRI scanner. They're probably very bored. This is probably a good representation of the default mode network. Under psilocybin, you have this massive you could think the filters are kind of off. All these connections are now allowed to kind of these regions are now able to interact with each other.
Is there what's the connection to like the after effects of keeping those connections, and is there any?
Yeah, so there's probably the therapeutic effects are likely coming from something derived from this. So we talked about kind of one of the great analogies that people often use is like this, like the snow globe effect, or like if you shake a snow globe and now like the snow's like there's no tracks in it right now, and it allows for you to kind of create new pathways.
There is some work where they visualize those pathway reconnections, and there's a whole lot going on during the experience, but afterwards there's what's the way that you call it? It's the structural.
Yeah,
change.
there are structural changes as well. Yeah, that come from the afterwards, and those won't happen immediately. Structural changes do take a period of weeks at least to come on.
I would also say that depends on your integration process as well too.
Absolutely.
That depending on like how your structures are going to go, depending on what your integration process looks like. Like, are you going back to just like doing nothing, or are you actually doing like stuff to actually integrate your process?
Yes.
Yeah, if this really kind of works those ruts out, you can just start digging those ruts back in where they came from,
Absolutely. Yeah. So, 100%.
There's another interesting fact here, according to David, not Professor Nutt, one of the leading researchers there. The amount of connections in both are the same relatively.
Yes.
What's happening is that we normally process all the data that comes to us in certain repetitive ways, and so that's kind of like this is habitual patterns here.
Yeah. But
when the development mode network and the normal way of processing is inhibited, we search for new ways.
Yeah. The constraints come off, and so that kind of goes into that integration process of now you're kind of able to create new connections, and these regions can now become more functionally connected. The strength of the functional connection can increase. So in a lot of ways, this is your brain, and this is your brain on drugs. You guys are old enough to remember those commercials?
Hey, Matt. Move 10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay. All right. So finishing up with psilocybin. So, looking at the brain structures and the chemistry is great, but is it changing your subjective experience, right? That's ultimately kind of what matters, right? Is how does this now translate to effects on your well-being, effects on your psychology? And so this, again, psilocybin has had tremendous effects with this. So the first studies that were done had to be very tightly controlled, had to be done in very controlled populations. So people with end-of-life anxiety and depression was some of the first groups that were looked at. So people with terminal cancer that were having the anxiety and depression that comes along with that were used as a population to study. And there's lots of documentaries that will interview the people in these studies, and just hearing their experiences. You can look at the data, but honestly, hearing what their experiences are is very powerful to think this acceptance and this increase in life satisfaction and kind of that existential dread going away is kind of very powerful to listen to. So those were some of the first populations. Now, people with major depression, treatment-resistant depression are kind of being subsequently studied with psilocybin and showing tremendous effects. And what's kind of important with this is oftentimes this is a 1 or 2 trial experiences. You're seeing these massive reductions in depression after just one or 2 experiences with this drug. So this isn't something that you're microdosing. This isn't a pill that you're having to take every day. This is a profound experience that is now alleviating these depressive symptoms. And then addiction is another area where this has been being looked at. So 80% success at 6 months for smoking cessation. That's a very, very powerful effect. Okay, this is actually the last thing on psilocybin. So just looking at when you're asking people during the experience what their subjective effects are. A lot of this stuff, especially towards the top, it's like my sense of time was distorted. I saw geometric patterns, which things that you would expect. But some of this stuff more towards the bottom is the experience had a spiritual quality. I experienced disintegration of myself or ego. These things are probably necessary to the experience and necessary to the therapeutic effects. So we've talked about pharmaceutical companies are going to want to kind of synthesize. Let's pull out the part of the drug that alleviates the depression and then leave all of these subjective things behind. What's that?
And they did that recently.
Yeah.
They're separate.
Yes. And they're trying. We'll see what the effects are. But so this paper, the subjective effects of psychedelics are necessary for their enduring therapeutic effect. So this is a Roland Griffiths paper. And just my thought, just reading that, would be it's not that it's not these visual distortions that are necessary. It's the spiritual quality. It's this disintegration of the ego. The experience had a supernatural quality. It's these revelatory experience, thoughts and experiences that you have probably are necessary for the therapeutic effects.
Before you jump from this, one thing you can see from this is one of the problems with legalization, medicalization. It's very difficult to do a controlled study of these substances. Look at the big, long red bar at I felt absolute or entirely normal is what that one says for the placebo group. Yeah. Right? So when you're taking the placebo, right? So that's a big problem when you try to do blind studies.
Right. And double blind, the researcher knows as well.
Yeah, exactly. The researcher also knows that you did not get the placebo.
They can tell, yeah.
Right. That's what that red line means. You know that you didn't get the placebo.
All right.
And interestingly enough, they did a triple blind trial where they gave people traditional hallucinogens and they couldn't tell them apart except for mushrooms because they were shorter.
Oh, interesting. That makes sense. Short duration.
Short duration.
Yeah.
That's the mushroom because they were often.
Right. Yeah. 4 to versus your 8 to 10 hours. So very quickly, we're running out of time here. I'm going to quickly go through some of the other psychedelics we're going to talk about. Mescaline, longer duration, slightly longer than psilocybin, probably not as long as LSD. Also, this is serotonin agonist. These have been used ceremonially for a very long time. So these are most prevalently used with Native Americans and Pacific Islanders. These were described as having a gentler psychedelic effect and more on the emotional side. The research on this is really just getting started, but some evidence for just overall general improved well-being afterwards. And less substance abuse issues. DMT, so ayahuasca, this might be, this is kind of the granddaddy or maybe the grandmother of them all. Yeah. Right, yeah. So this has been, very, very low usage currently in the United States, but obviously this has been increasing through ayahuasca retreats and the like in the last few years. This is the most potent of the entheogens. It's involved in, it's a serotonin agonist, but it also has affinity for the sigma-1 receptor. And I don't know a ton about the sigma-1 receptor. I think it was initially thought to be an opioid. It's found inside the cell, as far as I know. That kind of tells the cell to do different things. It's involved in neuroprotection, neuroplasticity, and shows some antidepressant, anti-anxiety effects. Obviously, this is ceremonial usage in South America for a long time. And what Joseph talked about earlier, this requires 2 different plants. So what's really interesting about ayahuasca is you have one DMT containing plant, but DMT is not
or it's metabolized.
well, it's not rare, yeah, but it's also not orally active unless you take it with an MAOI. And so these tribes across South America have figured out, well, this plant contains an MAOI that allows the DMT in this other plant to become orally active.
Yeah.
Well, right, yes. Yeah, so they would say, the plants told them. The plants have told them. It's very interesting that they discovered that. This one, you can go into rabbit holes with DMT. And then very quickly, ibogaine. We talked about this. This is separate from the classical psychedelics. Much more rare usage. It's antagonist at the NMDA receptor. So it's an antagonist at this excitatory receptor, which is more similar. So that is more similar to like a ketamine effect. Which NMDA is a glutamate receptor. It's the primary one involved in learning. So maybe this could have the effect of addiction treatment, where you're kind of unlearning. If you're an antagonist at this receptor that's involved in learning, maybe that's the potential. But also these cardiotoxic effects would probably require monitoring.
What's going on the loose hydrogen chain array? That's bizarre. I've never seen that.
I don't. It doesn't. It's 3-dimensional.
Yeah, it kind of pops out.
Okay.
Let's get into the organic chemistry now.
Yeah. I'm not a chemistry guy. But yeah. And so I don't know what effects that has, but this is definitely the classical psychedelics. Ibogaine is certainly separate in its structure and its mechanism of action from the rest of those. And just summary, I think we got time for a summary slide. Classical psychedelics, they're well tolerated with no neurotoxic effects. They're well tolerated if you don't have a history of mental illness, if you're not in an at-risk group. We know very well how they work. It's not kind of a mystery of how are these, what effects are these having in the brain. They have very well-known mechanisms of action, and they're rapidly being investigated for treatments for depression, for addiction, PTSD, these kinds of things. But what we didn't really talk about, I think is actually very important, is this concept of just using them for the betterment of the well. So these have profound effects with people that you don't have to be clinically diagnosed with depression or anxiety to get a profound positive experience from these substances. So you see lasting increases in openness. So one of the personality traits, openness to experience, mindfulness, life satisfaction, a lot of things that are kind of very analogous to somebody that might be a practiced meditator. And then lastly, just leave it with a quote from Michael Pollan. Michael Pollan was a New York Times bestselling author. A lot of food books, I think, is what his kind of mainstay was. Mm-hmm. He wrote a book, How to Change Your Mind, which there's a Netflix documentary series. He said, we tend to think of medicine as something that treats illness, but maybe we should broaden that definition to include substances that promote flourishing in people who are not technically ill. So we could all use a little bit more flourishing, I think. You don't have to be clinically diagnosed.
I'll talk this out here. So. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk us out with a couple of closing slides, and we have some events that we'll announce as well. Resources. This one link right here, if you can remember, decrimnaturenwa.org. We have a resources page. I'm not even going to pull it up. It's just, but go there. That's going to have the harm reduction. It's going to have the education. It's going to have the books and the documentaries and everything else, and also stuff with how to get in contact with us if you'd like to talk more with us. So with that, Beth, you have a couple of events. Yes, I can.
All right.
I'm good at that.
Wow, thank you everyone for coming tonight. The sense of community in this room is strong, and I'm thankful for each one of you, especially those of you who drove a long way. I can tell we have a lot of knowledge in this room. So if you're someone who has a level of expertise in any of these medicines or in biochemistry or some of the other things that I've kind of been hearing today, please stop and talk to us afterwards. We'd like to be able to lean on your expertise as we move forward with this effort. Next month in June, we go back and forth between Bentonville and Fayetteville. So next month we're in Fayetteville at the Fayetteville Public Library in the Ziegler reception room. That's a bigger room than this one. And so let's fill that one too. When people come, when we have physical bodies in physical rooms, that shows people that we care. Robert Bronson is a retired clinical social worker who's worked for the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs. He has over 20 years of experience in the field, and he's worked with a lot of veterans. And so we want to get as many veterans out as possible. If you know people who are in leadership in veterans organizations and groups, we want to get the word out to veterans that we're going to be talking about them specifically and how we can help.
And this is an important bridge to others in the community that may not consider this being a worthwhile topic. It helps veterans.
It helps veterans, and it helps first responders, law enforcement, a lot of people who are in professions that are high stress and high trauma are people who could especially benefit from these medicines. And we want to help make them more available to those people. And then in July, we are not going to meet on the third Tuesday in July. We're going to meet on a Saturday. We are going to do a symposium, a 10 to 3 event where we've got some very special speakers coming. Lieutenant Sarko Gergerian, who knows who he is?
Yeah.
He's gained quite a bit of fame in our country. He is, let me just read this. He's a trailblazing law enforcement officer and licensed mental health counselor based in Massachusetts. With over 15 years of experience in public service and trauma-informed care, Sarko has become a national voice in the intersection of mental health, public safety, and psychedelic healing. He made history in 2024 as the first active duty police officer in the United States to receive permission from his department to participate in a psychedelic church as a religious accommodation under the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act. Awesome. Sarko's advocacy is featured in Michael Pollan's Netflix documentary, How to Change Your Mind, where his journey highlights the role of psychedelics in fostering resilience among first responders. He has advised on psychedelic policy reform, including support for Massachusetts ballot question 4, and champions cognitive liberty, harm reduction, and ethical access. Through public speaking, community engagement, and legislative work, Sarko continues to challenge stigma and inspire healing within the systems that need it most. We're also going to have Taryn Hale. Taryn is a seasoned attorney with more than 30 years of legal experience and a deep personal commitment to plant medicine advocacy. His journey from public defense to entheogenic law was shaped by a spiritual and psychological crisis that ultimately led him to sacred plant work, an experience he credits with saving his life. Taryn now bridges his legal expertise with a passion for defending religious and cognitive liberty, advising individuals and groups navigating the legal complexities of entheogenic use. He gained national attention in 2022 for his pro bono defense, I'm gonna cry, of our own Jessica Fitzmaurice.
There she is. Oh, there she is.
An Indiana nurse who faced decades in prison for growing psilocybin mushrooms to treat her treatment-resistant depression. His coordinated effort with national experts, including Dr. James Fadiman, helped reduce her charges dramatically and sparked a wider conversation about mental health and plant medicine in the legal system. Taryn continues to support individuals facing prosecution, consult on RFRA protections, and speak on the spiritual context of psychedelic healing. So we hope that you all will come to that very special symposium. We're still working on a location, but we hope to have one for you shortly. Please stay connected. We have a Facebook group. We have a website where you can get, we want your email information. Watch for our emails. And then finally, our education nights are made possible through the support of the community. And there are so many ways you can be a part of it. Whether it's bringing a snack, which we didn't have tonight, I'm sorry, sponsoring the room rental at a library, or helping bring in a guest speaker. Every contribution helps in creating a welcoming, nourishing space for learning and connection. So if you're interested in supporting a future event, there is a Sign Up Genius link on the events page of our website. You'll find a range of opportunities that fit different time and budget levels, and we're also open to creative ideas for collaboration as well. Don't forget to sign up for our emails and talk to us so you can learn more. We have to be out of this room, like we have to be out of the library by 8 o'clock. And so we're gonna start breaking the room down in 7 minutes at 7:30. We would love for your help in putting chairs away and reformatting the room. We have 7 minutes for questions and answers. Is there anybody who has something they'd like to ask yet?
Are there any studies about dementia or Alzheimer's and the use of that?
Yes, it's being studied right now.
Do you know anything specifically about that?
Parkinson's, it's showing promising benefits for Parkinson's patients in elevation of mood and bringing back some of their memory, which is powerful. Yeah.
Could you put these slides on your website?
Yes. Yeah. These will be on. We're gonna actually put this entire presentation on our YouTube channel, where we have all of our previous education nights as well. So we always try to record these education nights so that if we weren't able to come, we can go back and watch it later. So we have a YouTube channel, and there's links on our website on the events page. Anybody else? Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, I'd love
connected.
to know what keeps you guys up at night, thinking this bold move and publicizing all these things for yourself and creating all of this. Let's say we all jump in and we all participate fully, right? What still keeps you up at night?
What keeps, like, what do I worry about?
Yeah, specifically to decred, not in the world of things, but in your decred efforts.
I don't worry because I feel so supported by the universe.
Is that setting us up for a spike?
I have moments where I get really scared, especially the moments when I'm walking up to the front door of a city council member and knocking on it, which I did this week. And I was blessed with the most amazing experience, supportive, loving, welcoming, how can I help you experience. Yeah. But we want to be able to show up when we can get to the city council level. So we need you to stay connected. Anybody else have any questions? Yeah.
This isn't a question, it's just a thank you to everybody. I feel like our ancestors are pretty stoked about what's happening right now.
Who would have thought? Where's the Arkansas? Anybody else? Again, thank you so much for coming tonight. We appreciate your presence, your physical presence. It means so much. Have a great night.
Thank you.